The air in the boardroom was colder than the marble floors, thick with the scent of old money and fresh grief. At the head of the table sat Thomas Sterling, the heir apparent, his arm draped possessively around his beautiful mistress Isabella. He was about to inherit a billion-dollar empire. Across from them sat his wife, Eleanor, a ghost in a black dress. As the lawyer read the will, Thomas launched a vicious attack, demanding a share for his lover and shaming the wife he'd long since discarded. But he had no idea that every venomous word he spoke was a nail in his own coffin, because the quiet woman he was humiliating wasn't just a grieving widow. She was the keeper of a final devastating secret, and she was about to bring his entire world crashing down. The boardroom on the 50th floor of Sterling Innovations was a cathedral of corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, godlike view of the city. But today the sky was a sheet of slate grey mirroring the mood within. The long obsidian table reflected the strained faces of the 5 people gathered to hear the last will and testament of Richard Sterling, the titan who had built this empire from nothing. At the head of the table in the chair his father had occupied for 4 decades sat Thomas Sterling. He wore his grief like he wore his Tom Ford suit, impeccably tailored and for public display only. At 42, he had his father's sharp jawline, but none of his contemplative silence. Thomas was a man of appetites, and his primary appetite, now that his father was gone, was for power. Tucked under his arm, so close she was practically a part of him, was Isabella Rossi. Young, vibrant, and exuding a confidence that bordered on predatory, she was the stark opposite of the woman seated across from them. Her dress was a shade of crimson that screamed defiance in the face of mourning. She ran a perfectly manicured hand up and down Thomas's arm, her touch both a comfort and a claim. She had been Thomas's secret for 2 years, a secret so poorly kept that even the company's janitors knew her name. Seated to Thomas's right was his younger sister, Catherine Sterling Davies. A nervous, bird-like woman, she clutched a damp tissue in her hand, her eyes red-rimmed. She loved her father, but had always been intimidated by him, and now she seemed just as intimidated by the sheer avarice radiating from her brother. And then there was Eleanor Sterling, Thomas's wife. She sat alone at the far end of the table, a deliberate island of solitude. In a simple, high-necked black dress, with her pale blonde hair pulled back in a severe knot, she looked less like a grieving widow and more like a piece of forgotten statuary. She hadn't wept, not publicly. She had organized the funeral with a quiet, unnerving efficiency that Thomas had mistaken for coldness. For 10 years, she had been the perfect corporate wife, elegant, discreet, and utterly invisible. Today she seemed to have perfected that invisibility. Her gaze was fixed on the city below her posture, ramrod straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. To Thomas and Isabella she was a bothersome formality, the final tedious loose end to be dealt with before their real life could begin. The 5th person in the room was Arthur Finch, the family's long-time lawyer. A man in his late 60s, with a face of wrinkled parchment, Finch was the embodiment of discretion and tradition. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat, and the rustle of the thick parchment paper was the only sound in the suffocating silence. "We are gathered," Finch began, his voice dry as dust, "to execute the final wishes of Richard Charles Sterling." This document was prepared and signed on the 3rd of January, 2024, and has been verified as his last and true testament. Thomas leaned forward, a hungry glint in his eyes. This was it, the coronation. He had worked under his father, yes, but always as a subordinate, a prince waiting for the king to die. He had listened to Richard's lectures on legacy, on responsibility, on the Sterling name, all the while thinking, just give me the keys. Isabella squeezed his arm, her whisper a silken promise. It's all yours now, my love. Everything you deserve. Thomas gave her a confident smirk. He glanced at Eleanor, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Why was she even here? Their marriage had been a hollow shell for years, an arrangement of convenience that suited his public profile. He had provided her with a beautiful home, an unlimited credit card, and the prestige of the Sterling name. What more could she possibly want? He had already instructed his own lawyer to draw up divorce papers with a generous but final settlement to be served the day after the inheritance was settled. Let's get on with it, Arthur. Thomas said, his tone impatient. We all know what my father wanted. I'm ready to take the reins. Arthur Finch looked at Thomas over the top of his glasses, his expression unreadable. As you wish, Thomas. The will is quite direct. He began to read his voice, a monotone drone that methodically dismantled Richard Sterling's life's work into assets, trusts, and bequests. Arthur Finch's voice filled the room, weaving a narrative of numbers and legal clauses. He began with the smaller bequests, a generous donation to the city's art museum, lifetime pensions for his long-serving household staff, and a sizable, though not extravagant, trust fund for his daughter Catherine. Catherine dabbed her eyes with the tissue. "Oh, Daddy," she whispered, a sound of genuine sorrow and gratitude. Thomas nodded magnanimously, as if he were bestowing the gift himself. It was all predictable, all part of the script he had played in his head 1,000 times. Then came the main event. To my only son, Thomas Richard Sterling. Finch read his voice, gaining a slight gravitas. I bequeath the entirety of my controlling interest in Sterling Innovations, comprising 60% of all voting shares. I also bequeath to him the Sterling family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, and all properties contained therein. A wave of palpable relief and triumph washed over Thomas. He sat back in his father's chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He was no longer the prince. He was the king. He squeezed Isabella's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. She beamed at him, her eyes sparkling with 1,000 future diamonds. It was done. It was his. Finch paused, taking a sip of water. There are, of course, provisions and codicils. Thomas waved a dismissive hand. Details, Arthur, details. The company is mine. That's all that matters. Indeed. Finch said, his gaze briefly flicking towards Eleanor, before returning to the page. The will continues, regarding my daughter-in-law, Eleanor Sterling. At the mention of her name, Eleanor's posture didn't change, but a subtle tension entered the room. Thomas's smile tightened. Isabella shifted in her seat, her expression hardening into a mask of polite indifference. I have established a trust in the amount of $5 million, Finch read. A paltry sum, Thomas thought. A rounding error in the Sterling fortune. This trust will provide an annual stipend for her lifetime on the condition. Finch paused, clearing his throat again. On the condition that she does not remarry, and conducts herself in a manner that brings no disrepute upon the Sterling name. Upon her death, any remaining principal will revert to the main Sterling family trust. It was a slap in the face, and it was designed to be. A golden cage. Enough money to live comfortably, but not enough to be truly independent. The clauses were a leash, ensuring she would forever remain Thomas Sterling's widow, a quiet, well-behaved relic. Thomas couldn't suppress a smirk. It was perfect, better than he could have hoped. His father, even in his final act, had understood the need to keep up appearances while ensuring the real power stayed where it belonged. But then Finch read a clause that was unexpected. "Finally," the lawyer intoned, "I wish to acknowledge the deep comfort and companionship I received in my final difficult months. To the person who provided me with solace and understanding when I felt most isolated, I wish for my son Thomas to provide a discretionary gift from the estate, a sum he deems fair and just in recognition of their loyalty." The room was silent for a moment, as the words hung in the air. Thomas frowned. Who was his father talking about? A nurse, a friend he didn't know about. It was Isabella who saw the opening first, her mind always quick, always opportunistic, seized upon the ambiguity. She squeezed Thomas's hand hard, her eyes wide with a dawning, brilliant idea. She leaned in and whispered urgently in his ear. "He's talking about me, darling." She breathed her voice a mixture of feigned humility and raw ambition. "Remember all those times I came to the house, I'd sit with him while you were in meetings. We'd talk for hours. I brought him his tea. He called me his ray of sunshine." The story was a fabrication, a grotesque distortion of the 2 or 3 awkward, stilted encounters she'd had with the patriarch who had looked at her with thinly veiled contempt. But Thomas, blinded by his infatuation and his own ego, didn't see the lie. He saw an opportunity to legitimize Isabella, to reward her, and to stick one final public knife into the back of his wife. He sat up straight, his face transforming into a mask of solemn purpose. "Arthur," he said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "I know exactly who my father was referring to." He turned not to the lawyer, but to the entire room, his gaze deliberately sweeping past Eleanor. "He was talking about Isabella." A collective silent gulp seemed to be sucked from the room. Catherine stared at her brother, her brow furrowed in confusion. Arthur Finch's face remained a stony mask, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Eleanor. Eleanor remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the grey sky as if the drama unfolding was nothing more than a passing cloud. Thomas stood up his chair, scraping back harshly against the polished floor. He pulled Isabella to her feet, holding her hand aloft, as if presenting a trophy. "For the past 2 years," he began, his voice booming with the self-righteousness of a man convinced of his own virtue, "Isabella has been more than just my partner. She has been a light in this family." He began to pace his footsteps, it echoing in the tense silence. "My father was a lonely man in his final years. He was traditional private. He didn't always know how to show his feelings, while others were preoccupied." He shot a venomous glance at Eleanor. "Isabella was there. She brought warmth and laughter into that big, empty house. She listened to him. She cared for him." Isabella, a consummate actress, lowered her head, a single perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek. "He was like a father to me," she whispered, her voice choked with manufactured emotion. "I miss him so much." Thomas moved to her side, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. "You see," he demanded of the room, "you see her heart. This woman right here is the companion my father spoke of. Not some nurse, not some distant friend. Her, Isabella Rossi." He turned his full attention to Eleanor, his voice dripping with condescension. "Eleanor, you were his daughter-in-law. You did your duty, I suppose. You showed up for holidays, you planned the occasional dinner party. But were you there for him? Did you sit with him? Did you hold his hand when he was in pain? Or were you too busy with your charities, your lunches, your empty life? The cruelty of the attack was breathtaking. He was publicly rewriting history, painting his loyal, dignified wife as a cold, uncaring shrew, and his mistress as a saint. He was using his dead father's words to sanctify his own infidelity. The will asks for a discretionary gift. Thomas continued, his voice hardening. But I think that's too modest. It's clear what my father intended. He was a man of honor. He would want the woman who brought him comfort to be taken care of, to be recognized as a true member of this family. That trust fund, he pointed a finger at the will on the table, the one set aside for Eleanor. The $5 million. It's an insult to Isabella's devotion. Catherine finally spoke up, her voice trembling. Thomas, what are you saying? That's Eleanor's inheritance. It's a conditional pittance, Thomas shot back. And frankly, she doesn't deserve it. Isabella does. I am the executor of this estate now. I am the head of this family. And I am making a decision. Arthur, he commanded, turning to the lawyer, I want you to begin the process of redirecting that trust. It belongs to Isabella. It's what my father would have wanted. Isabella sobbed theatrically into his shoulder. Oh, Thomas, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he said, stroking her hair. It's a matter of justice, a matter of honor. He looked down the long, polished table at his wife. She was finally looking at him. Her eyes, the color of a winter sea, were not filled with tears or anger. They were clear calm, and held a depth of knowledge that for the first time made him feel a sliver of unease. He expected hysterics, accusations, a pathetic plea. He got none of it. He saw her as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be swept aside. His affair had been a constant source of friction, a silent war waged in their cold, cavernous home. He had been waiting for this moment of absolute power, the moment he could finally discard her completely without consequence. And here it was. He was using his father's legacy as the ultimate weapon to win the war. Well, Eleanor, he goaded her, wanting to break that infuriating composure. Do you have anything to say? Any objection to honoring my father's true wishes? The silence stretched thick and heavy. Arthur Finch watched her, his pen poised above his legal pad. Catherine held her breath. Isabella looked up from Thomas's chest, a triumphant, venomous smirk playing on her lips. Eleanor's gaze did not waver. It held Thomas's steady and unblinking. After a long moment, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a shard of glass. That won't be necessary, Arthur. The three simple words landed with the force of a physical blow. Thomas, who had been puffing his chest out in a display of dominance, seemed to deflate slightly. Isabella's smirk faltered. What did you say? Thomas asked, his voice sharp with annoyance. Eleanor rose from her chair. The movement was fluid and graceful, devoid of hesitation. All eyes were on her as she picked up the small black leather handbag that had been sitting by her feet. She placed it on the table and opened the clasp with a quiet, decisive click. I said, she repeated her voice perfectly, even that your instructions to Mr. Finch will not be necessary. She reached into the handbag and withdrew a single thick envelope. It was made of heavy cream-colored vellum, the kind reserved for the most important correspondence. The flap was sealed not with glue, but with a dollop of dark red wax impressed with the distinctive Sterling family signet ring, a lion rampant. Holding a key, She held it up for a moment, letting everyone in the room see it. It was an object that radiated importance, a relic from a bygone era of handwritten letters and unbreakable seals. Thomas stared at it, a knot of confusion and anger tightening in his gut. "What is that more of your dramatic nonsense?" Eleanor ignored him. She walked the length of the table, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Her progress was unhurried, measured a queen moving across a chessboard. She didn't look at Thomas or Isabella as she passed them. Her focus was entirely on the man at the end of the table. She stopped beside Arthur Finch and placed the sealed envelope on the gleaming surface in front of him. "Richard asked me to give this to you," she said, her voice now addressed only to the lawyer. "He gave it to me 6 weeks ago, on the day he came home from the hospital for the last time. His instructions were very specific. He told me to wait. He said I was to let the proceedings begin, to listen to everything that was said, and to only present this if and when I felt his true character was being fundamentally betrayed." She paused, then turned her head slowly, her icy gaze finally settling on her husband. "I believe that moment has arrived." A chilling silence descended upon the room. The implications of her words began to dawn on them. Arthur Finch stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly reached out a trembling hand and turned it over. The seal was perfect, unbroken. The front of the envelope bore his name, Mr. Arthur Finch, written in a familiar, forceful script, the unmistakable handwriting of Richard Sterling. "What is this, Eleanor?" Thomas demanded, his voice a low growl. "Some sentimental letter." "A last-minute plea for you. He was too embarrassed to put in the will." "It's meaningless. The will has been read. It's over." "Is it, Thomas?" Eleanor replied, a cool challenge in her tone. Finch took a sterling silver letter opener from his breast pocket. He looked at Thomas, then at Eleanor, then back at the envelope. "Eleanor," he said, his voice raspy with a new gravity, "are you claiming this document has legal standing?" "I'm not claiming anything, Arthur," she said. "I'm following my husband's final instructions, Richard's instructions." The distinction was deliberate and sharp. "He told me you would know what to do." With a decisive slit, Finch broke the wax seal. The crackle of the old paper being unfolded sounded like a thunderclap in the silent room. He spread the single sheet of vellum on the table and began to read it to himself. The transformation of Arthur Finch was astonishing. The stoic professional mask dissolved, replaced by an expression of profound shock, then dawning comprehension, and finally a kind of grim, sad respect. His face paled. He looked up from the page, his eyes wide behind his glasses, and stared at Eleanor, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not the quiet, invisible wife, but the chosen confidant, the keeper of the final secret. He looked at Thomas, and for the first time in their long association, there was a flicker of pity in the old lawyer's eyes. "My God," Finch whispered, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. He picked up the document he had been reading from the one that had crowned Thomas king, and set it carefully aside. "It appears," he announced to the stunned room, "that the document I have just read is not in fact the final testament of Richard Sterling." He held up the single sheet of vellum from the envelope. It is a holographic will, written, dated, and signed entirely in Richard's own hand, 2 weeks after the previous one. Under state law, this document revokes all prior wills. This is the real will." The air in the room became thin, difficult to breathe. Thomas stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. A holographic will. That's ridiculous. My father was a meticulous man. He wouldn't scribble his last wishes on a piece of paper like a madman. It's a forgery. She forged it. Isabella. Her face ashen, clung to his arm. He's right. She's a manipulative liar. She's trying to steal from you. Finch held up a hand to silence them. I knew Richard Sterling's signature and his hand for 40 years, Thomas. This is genuine. Furthermore, he added, tapping a section at the bottom of the page, it is witnessed by his physician, Dr. Alan Carlyle, and his head of security, Mr. David Chen, both reputable, unimpeachable witnesses. Finch's words were a death knell to their protests. The document was ironclad. He put his glasses back on his hands, now steady, and began to read aloud. The words on this page were not the dry legalese of the previous document. This was Richard Sterling's true voice, unfiltered, powerful, and utterly ruthless. I, Richard Charles Sterling, being of sound mind and failing body, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament, revoking all others before it. Finch began. His voice was no longer a monotone. It carried the weight of the words he was speaking. I have spent my life building an empire not of glass and steel, but of integrity and vision. I had hoped to pass this legacy to my son, but I have been forced to accept a difficult truth. A man's character is not what he inherits, but what he builds for himself. And my son Thomas has built a house of cards on a foundation of deceit. Thomas staggered back as if he had been physically struck. What? He breathed. Finch continued, his voice relentless. To my son Thomas, I am not a fool. I never was. I saw the way you looked at your inheritance like a vulture circling a dying animal. I saw the way you treated your wife Eleanor, a woman of more substance and strength in her little finger than you have in your entire being. And I saw your mistress Isabella Rossi, a parasite of the highest order whose only talent is latching onto the success of others. Isabella let out a small, strangled cry, her face contorting in a mask of rage and humiliation. The will went on. I knew about your affair from the beginning. I tolerated it, hoping it was a phase, a final spasm of immaturity before you embraced your responsibilities. I was wrong. It was not a phase. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness. A lack of loyalty, a poverty of spirit. Your performance today, which I am certain is unfolding as I write this, will be the final proof of that sickness. It was devastating. Richard had anticipated it all. The will Thomas had thought was his coronation was in fact his final test. A trap laid from beyond the grave. And he had walked right into it, dragging Isabella with him. Therefore, Finch read, his voice dropping to a somber note. My bequests are as follows. To my daughter Catherine, I leave the same trust fund as stipulated previously, with one addition, an immediate cash bequest of $10 million, a reward for the quiet decency I fear will be sorely tested by her brother's foolishness. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. To Isabella Rossi, Finch continued, and Isabella flinched as if her name were a curse for her comfort and companionship. I leave the sum of $1 to be paid from Thomas's personal accounts. I also direct my estate to file a permanent restraining order, barring her from all Sterling properties and from contacting any member of my family or company employees. Let her find her fortune elsewhere. Isabella stared, speechless. Her dream of becoming Mrs. Sterling and a billionaire heiress vaporizing before her eyes. To my son Thomas, Finch's voice was grim. You want the Sterling name. You may keep it. You want a place in my company. You shall have one. You are to be given a non-executive role in the marketing department at a salary I have stipulated in a private addendum with Mr. Finch. You will receive a small non-voting 5% share of the company's stock held in a trust that you cannot sell or borrow against. This is more than you have earned and more than you deserve. Should you refuse the position or be terminated for cause, the trust will be dissolved and you will receive nothing. You will report to the new CEO. Thomas's face was a mottled canvas of red and white. New CEO. What new CEO I am? The CEO. Arthur Finch took a deep, steadying breath and read the final world-altering paragraph. All the remainder of my estate, the Sterling family home in Greenwich, my art collection, my personal investments, and most importantly, my 51% controlling interest in Sterling Innovations, along with the titles of Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, I leave wholly and without condition to the only person who ever truly understood what legacy means. Finch looked up from the page, his gaze settling on the calm, composed woman at his side. I leave everything to my beloved and trusted daughter-in-law, Eleanor Sterling. She was the true companion of my final years. She was the one with whom I discussed business strategy, the one who shared my vision, the one who showed unwavering loyalty not to my money, but to my principles. The company is hers. The legacy is hers. She has earned it. For a full 10 seconds after Arthur Finch uttered the name Eleanor Sterling, the world seemed to stop. The only sound was the faint electronic hum of the climate control system. The revelation was so total, so audacious, that it defied immediate comprehension. It hung in the air, a monstrous, shimmering thing, too large for anyone to grasp. Thomas stood frozen, his face a bloodless mask of confusion. It was as if he'd been spoken to in a language he'd never heard, the sounds familiar, but the meaning utterly alien. Then a sound broke the silence. It was a laugh, not a sound of humor, but a sharp, ugly bark of pure disbelief. "That's good, Eleanor." Thomas choked out a grotesque smile, twisting his lips. "Really? A masterpiece of theater. Did you write it yourself? Did you pay off Dad's doctor to sign it?" "Arthur," he pleaded, turning to the lawyer as the only sane man in a world gone mad. "For God's sake, put an end to this farce. My father was sick, his mind was going. She took advantage of him. This document is a pathetic forgery, and we all know it." Arthur Finch, however, did not look at Thomas. His gaze was fixed on the vellum page, his expression one of grim finality. "Thomas, I have already stated the facts. This is Richard's hand. The witnesses, Dr. Carlyle and Mr. Chen, are men of unimpeachable integrity. They would not perjure themselves. This document is legally ironclad." He placed the will deliberately on the table between himself and Eleanor, a clear physical alignment of his loyalty. "This is the reality." The word reality seemed to be the trigger. The thin dam of Thomas's denial shattered, and a lifetime of entitled rage came roaring forth. Reality. The word was a primal scream that echoed off the glass walls. He lunged toward the table, his hands clawing his face, a mottled canvas of purple and red. "I'll tell you the reality." "The reality is that she is a conniving, manipulative parasite who whispered poison into a dying man's ear. He was my father. That company, that house, that life. That is my birthright." David Chen, the head of security, moved with quiet swiftness, placing himself between Thomas and the table. It was a silent, impassive barrier that Thomas dared not cross. Thwarted, he spun around, his wild eyes searching for an ally. His gaze fell upon his sister. "Catherine Cat, say something," he implored, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't let her do this. This is our family, our legacy. She's an outsider. She's destroying everything." Catherine flinched, tears streaming down her face. She looked at her brother's contorted face, at Eleanor's impossible calm, and at the will that had upended their universe. She saw the truth as painful as it was. Her father had done this, deliberately. She opened her mouth, but only a small, broken sob escaped. Her silence was a more damning verdict than any words could have been. It was at this moment of total desperation that Arthur Finch chose to deliver the final killing blow. He cleared his throat, his voice cutting through Thomas's ragged breathing. "Thomas, I must advise you to stop. There is one final addendum from Richard that I was instructed to reveal only if this will was contested. Richard anticipated this exact reaction." Finch slid a small, sealed memory card onto the table. "He recorded a video statement 3 weeks ago. In it, he calmly and lucidly explains his reasoning, his observations of your character, your handling of the European division, your affair with Ms. Rossi, and his decision to entrust his legacy to Eleanor. His instructions are clear. If any legal challenge is mounted, this video is to be delivered to every member of the board of directors, and if necessary, released to the Associated Press." Checkmate. It was a move of such breathtaking posthumous strategy that it left everyone speechless. A video. The ultimate public shaming. Thomas could imagine it vividly, his powerful, articulate father calmly dismantling him piece by piece for the entire world to see. He wouldn't just be disinherited, he would be annihilated. The fight drained out of him, replaced by the cold, sick dread of absolute defeat. He was trapped, utterly and completely trapped, and it was in that moment of his utter powerlessness that Isabella Rossi finally saw him clearly. Her dream, the glorious future she had been building for 2 years, had evaporated in a matter of minutes. The man she had clung to, the king-in-waiting, was now a deposed, pathetic court jester. He was no longer an asset. He was a fool, and she had no use for fools. Her hand, which had been gripping his arm, dropped away, as if he were diseased. Her face, moments before a mask of shared outrage, became a vision of pure reptilian contempt. "You idiot!" she hissed, her voice low and dripping with venom. It was directed solely at him. "You absolute arrogant idiot! I told you she was smart. I told you not to underestimate her. But you were so sure, so blinded by your own ego." Thomas stared at her, uncomprehending. "Bella, don't you Bella me," she spat, taking a step back. "You have nothing. You are nothing. A marketing analyst. A pittance of a trust fund. I didn't hitch my wagon to a middle manager." She looked him up and down, her lip curling in disgust. "You weren't the king. You were just the spoiled little prince, and you failed the test. I'm done with you." Without a glance at anyone else, she snatched her crimson handbag from the floor. With her head held high, a queen of a fallen kingdom, she strode out of the boardroom. The sharp, angry click-clack of her heels on the marble floor was the sound of Thomas's final illusion, shattering into 1,000 pieces. He was utterly, completely alone. He sagged against a chair, the rage and denial replaced by a hollow, gaping void. He looked across the vast, polished expanse of the table at his wife. The woman he had ignored, cheated on, and less than an hour ago had tried to publicly strip of her dignity. The woman who now owned his past, his present, and his future. "Eleanor." His voice was a broken whisper. Why? It was a question born of pure incomprehension. In his world, power was taken, not given. Loyalty was a transaction. He could not fathom the series of events that had led to this. Eleanor met his gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating smirk. There was only a profound, weary clarity, as if she were a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "This isn't about me, and it isn't about you, Thomas," she said, her voice steady and even. "It's about the company. It's about the legacy. Richard built Sterling Innovations to last for 100 years. He knew your appetites, your recklessness. He knew you would have sold it off in pieces to fund your lifestyle within a decade. He didn't do this to punish you for the affair. The affair was just a symptom of the real disease, a fundamental lack of character." She stood up, her movement fluid and certain. The invisible mantle of leadership settled upon her shoulders, and it fit perfectly. Her voice, when she spoke again, was different. The soft, wifely tones were gone, replaced by the crisp, clear voice of a chief executive officer. "Arthur," she began, turning to the lawyer, "please arrange a meeting with the full board for 9 a.m. tomorrow. I want complete financial workups on the European division on every member's desk by 8. Also, please have legal draft the paperwork for Ms. Rossie's restraining order and have it filed by the end of the day." "Of course, Eleanor," Finch said, already making notes. The name Eleanor sounded different now, not familiar, but formal. "Catherine," she said, her tone softening as she looked at her weeping sister-in-law. "I want you at that meeting. Your father respected your integrity. It's a quality this company needs more of. We'll talk about your role going forward." Catherine looked up, shocked, and could only nod, wiping her eyes. Finally, Eleanor's gaze fell on David Chen, and then on the broken man who was still legally her husband. "David," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Please escort Mr. Sterling from the building. His executive access credentials have been revoked, effective immediately. Human Resources will contact him on Monday with the orientation package for his new position." And with that, the transfer of power was complete. Thomas Sterling, the heir apparent, looked up in disbelief as the security chief took a polite but firm step toward him. He was being dismissed, fired from his own life, as David Chen gently but inexorably guided him towards the door. Thomas took one last look at the boardroom, at the woman in his father's chair, her back already turned to him as she conferred with her lawyer. She wasn't just taking his father's company, she was erasing him. He wasn't the victim of a palace coup, he was a footnote in the story of the new queen. 3 months later, the city visible from the 50th floor office was no longer a canvas of slate grey, but a brilliant, crystalline blue. The oppressive atmosphere of the inheritance meeting had dissipated like a bad dream, replaced by the clean, sharp air of a new season and a new era. The office itself, for 40 years, the hallowed sanctum of Richard Sterling, was now unequivocally Eleanor's. She had respected its history, keeping the heavy book-matched mahogany desk and the shelves of leather-bound classics that smelled of time and tobacco. The portraits of Sterling patriarchs still looked down from the walls, their gazes stern and appraising. But life had been breathed back into the space. A trio of elegant white orchids now graced the credenza, their living beauty a stark contrast to the stiff, dusty ferns Richard had favored. Spread across the large conference table were not stock market reports, but architectural blueprints and environmental impact studies for a new sustainable energy division, a passion project she and Richard had secretly sketched out on napkins during his final months. The room was no longer a museum of past glories, but a vibrant command center, humming with the energy of the future. The woman at the center of this universe was herself transformed. The quiet, almost translucent figure from the boardroom had been shed like a snakeskin. In her place was a leader. Today, Eleanor wore a tailored navy blue suit that spoke of authority, not armor. Her pale blonde hair, once pulled back in a severe, self-effacing knot, was now cut in a chic, professional bob that framed a face that was more focused, more alive than it had been in a decade. There were still moments late at night when the building was quiet that she would run a hand over the worn leather of Richard's chair and feel a tremor of the immense weight she now carried. But fear was not part of the equation, only purpose. Her first trial had come just 18 hours after the reading of the will. She had walked into that same boardroom for the emergency meeting she had called to face a table of 7 board members, all men, all over 60, all fiercely loyal to Richard, and all deeply, profoundly skeptical of her. They had known her only as Thomas's pretty, silent wife, a decorative piece of a corporate dynasty. They saw her as a placeholder, a grieving widow handed a toy she couldn't possibly understand. She remembered the feeling of their collective gaze, a physical weight of doubt. Marcus Thorne, a gruff, silver-haired industrialist and Richard's oldest friend, had been the most openly hostile. He hadn't even bothered with pleasantries. "Eleanor," he had said, his voice a low rumble of disapproval. "We all respected Richard's final wishes. But this is a billion-dollar, publicly traded company, not a country club to be bequeathed. The markets are jittery. The board requires a plan, a real one, not just a continuation of the status quo." She had let the challenge hang in the air, meeting his gaze without blinking. She didn't respond with emotion or a plea for their trust. She responded with competence. "You're right, Marcus," she had said, her calm voice cutting through the tension. She gestured to a screen at the end of the room, and a complex financial chart appeared. "The status quo is unacceptable, specifically in our European logistics division." For the next hour, she had held them captive. She laid bare with surgical precision the deep-seated problems in the very division Thomas had been managing for the past 3 years. She spoke of bloated overhead, inefficient supply chains, and a series of ill-advised acquisitions that were hemorrhaging money. She didn't just present problems. She presented solutions. A multi-phase restructuring plan complete with cost-benefit analyses, risk assessments, and projected timelines. It was detailed, brilliant, and aggressive. "This is an excellent plan." Thorne had conceded, his tone grudging. "Far too detailed for a newcomer. Who drew it up for you?" Eleanor had allowed herself a small, cool smile. "Richard and I," she said simply. "We worked on it for the better part of a year. He called it the contingency. He believed in preparing for every eventuality." The implication was clear. Richard hadn't just handed her the keys in a fit of pique. He had trained her. He had prepared her. She was not the contingency. Thomas's failure had been. That day, she had walked into the boardroom as Thomas's wife. She had walked out as their CEO. Now, 3 months into her reign, the results were undeniable. The stock was up 12%. The logistics restructuring was ahead of schedule. Morale, which had stagnated under Thomas's brand of lazy, arrogant management, was soaring. She led not with fear, but with expectation. She demanded the best from her people because she demanded it from herself. Her office door opened, and Catherine came in holding 2 mugs of coffee. The alliance between the 2 women had become the new bedrock of the Sterling family. Freed from the oppressive shadow of her brother, Catherine had blossomed. Eleanor had given her full autonomy over the Sterling Foundation, transforming it from a sleepy tax shelter into a dynamic force for good in the city. "The quarterly reports are even better than we projected," Catherine said, her face glowing with pride as she handed Eleanor a mug. "Finance is calling it the Eleanor effect. The press is sticking with the Sterling savior." Eleanor laughed, a genuine, warm sound. "The press is dramatic. We're just airing out a stuffy room. The foundations Richard built were solid. They just needed tending." "You're doing more than tending," Catherine insisted, settling into one of the chairs opposite the desk. "You're building something new. Dad would be so proud." They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the bond between them forged in the fire of their shared, strange inheritance. "I saw him today," Catherine said quietly, her expression shifting. "Thomas, in the cafeteria." Eleanor's posture didn't change, but a stillness came over her. "Oh, he looks grey," Catherine said, struggling for the right word. "He's lost so much weight." He just sat by himself at a small table eating a sandwich. No one talked to him. It's like he's a ghost. I almost went over, but what would I even say? She looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a sad confusion. "He's still my brother. It feels wrong to see him so diminished." Eleanor thought back to the one and only conversation she'd had with Thomas since that day in the boardroom. He had ambushed her in the private garage about a month ago, his face a mask of desperation. He had tried everything. He pleaded, appealing to their decade of marriage, conveniently forgetting the last 3 years of it. He blamed Isabella, painting her as a manipulative siren who had led him astray. He tried to bargain, promising to be her right-hand man, her loyal soldier, if she would just restore his title, his dignity. She had listened patiently, her face unreadable. When he was finally done, his hollow words echoing off the cold concrete, her reply had been quiet, but absolute. "This was not my decision, Thomas. It was Richard's. He wrote the terms of your employment. Your title is marketing analyst. Your duties are clear. Your salary is generous for the position. You have a choice. You can perform your duties professionally and collect your paycheck and your trust stipend, or you can resign. If you resign, the trust is voided as per the will. There is no third option. There is no negotiation. So I'm just supposed to live like this." He had spat his desperation turning to venom. "Working in a cubicle while you sit in my father's chair, running my company." "It was never your company, Thomas." She had replied the words of final, clean severance. "You were just borrowing the name." She had walked away, leaving him standing alone by his modest company sedan, the gleaming Rolls-Royce that had once been his now belonging to the CEO's motor pool. She relayed a gentler version of this to Catherine. "He is diminished because he built his entire identity on things he didn't earn. His name, his expected inheritance. When those things were taken away, there was nothing left underneath." She looked at her sister-in-law, her voice softening. "You feel sorry for him because you have a good heart, Catherine. But Richard saw this coming. He didn't do this to be cruel. He did it to save the company from him." "I know," Catherine sighed, "but it's still hard to watch." "The best thing you can do for him," Eleanor said, her tone shifting back to the CEO, "is to succeed. The best thing we can do is to build this company into something so strong, so ethical, and so successful that Richard's final difficult choice is validated beyond any doubt." Catherine nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right. Now about the downtown literacy project." They spent the next hour working two powerful women, shaping a legacy the ghost in the cafeteria momentarily forgotten. Later that evening, long after Catherine and the rest of the building had gone home, Eleanor stood at the vast window, looking out at the city lights that glittered like a carpet of fallen stars. This was the view Richard had loved. She remembered standing in this spot with him one night about a month before he passed. He was frail, wrapped in a cashmere blanket in his wheelchair, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "They think you're just a pretty ornament, you know," he had said, his voice raspy. "Thomas, the board, they don't see you. They never have." "It's better that way," she had replied. "It makes things simpler." "For now," he had agreed. He'd been silent for a long time, then he'd tapped a folder in his lap. It was a proposal for an acquisition Thomas had been pushing hard for, a flashy tech startup with a charismatic founder and zero profits. "He wants to buy this company, says it's the future. What do you think?" She had looked through the financials he'd given her a week prior. "I think the founder is a good salesman," she said carefully. "And I think the company is a house of fire waiting for a match. Their debt-to-asset ratio is a disaster, their burn rate is unsustainable, and their proprietary technology is already being made obsolete by a competitor in South Korea. Buying it would be like buying an anchor for a drowning man." Richard had looked at her, and a slow, genuine smile had spread across his tired face. "I've had 3 different consulting firms analyze that company for the last 6 weeks, he'd said. "They took 80 pages to say exactly what you just said in 3 sentences. He had sighed, a heavy rattling sound. "He has my name. But you, my dear Eleanor, you have my mind." It was then that she knew. It wasn't just about his disappointment in Thomas. He was looking for a successor, someone who saw the world as he did, and he had found her in the most unlikely of places. A soft chime from her computer pulled her from the memory. It was an email from the head of the European division. The restructuring was entering its final phase. A new factory powered entirely by renewable energy, part of her new initiative, was breaking ground next month. Productivity was up. Profits were climbing. She looked out at the glittering city, no longer feeling the weight of the past, but the exhilarating pull of the future. She was not a savior, or a regent, or a placeholder. She was the matriarch. She had honored Richard's legacy by saving it from his son. Now she would build her own. And she was just getting started. And so the Sterling Empire was not lost, but reborn under the leadership of the one person who truly understood its value. Eleanor's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet patience, the silent observation, and the courage to act when the moment is right. Thomas Sterling didn't lose his inheritance because of a secret will. He lost it because of a public failure of character, a lesson his father delivered from beyond the grave. What do you think? Was Richard's final act a brilliant piece of strategic planning or a cruel, vengeful trap? Did Thomas get what he deserved, or was the punishment too harsh? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you were moved by this story of betrayal, justice, and the rise of an unexpected hero, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video with friends and family. And if you want more stories of real-life drama where the tables are turned in the most shocking ways, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.